Thank you for joining the second installment of the SystRx Patient Solutions Blueprint, Product Life Cycle Action Plan, and Assessment Strategies webinar. My name is Jan Nielsen, and I'm the Division President of Patient Solutions at SystRx.
And my name is Kevin Robbins. I'm Vice President of Business Development at SystRx. Today, in segment 2 of our webinar, we'll be talking about integrating solutions and adding value for your patients and providers. We'll be addressing your patient's need throughout their patient journey within your brand. We'll be addressing your patient needs throughout your brand life cycle. We'll also be discussing meeting patients within their life flow and providers within their daily workflows, as well as measuring your program performance and providing directive analytics that empowers all of your internal commercialization teams. So let's jump into your patient's journey. Jan, would you like to talk about how to decide what the best services are to support your brand?
Thanks, Kevin. To demonstrate the importance of program design, we'd like to show you first the patient perspective. This center line is an example of the patient's journey. At the left side of this line is where the patient is beginning to believe that there's something wrong, or maybe the patient's family is starting to recognize that there is a problem. Then as the line progresses towards the right, there's a diagnosis. Depending on the patient and the family, there's some research shortly before or after diagnosis, or it's looking at what is out on the market, what's available for treatment, what's going to be the cost, what are program supports that are available. And the patient continues forward until the point where a decision is made to go for treatment or to delay or not to pursue treatment. If your product is first or second line therapy product, you'll likely need to stay in touch with this patient along their decision-making journey, and then provide treatment, education, support, program education, and therapy reminders. If your product is fourth line, you only have the survivors left. You have people who, for some reason, have decided to stay in and fight. These patients are compliant, but they are sick. They are worried. They are beginning to feel as if they're becoming a burden to their family. They and their caregivers need a very different type of support than a first-in-line product. Additionally, you'll need to design your program around your patient population challenges. A second-line MS product will have a very different challenge than a plaque psoriasis patient population product. This first population may have cognitive challenges, require transportation assistance, refresher injection trainings, and require more high-touch adherence support at a more frequent cadence. The plaque psoriasis population may be able to take advantage of self-serve options such as online PAP support or copay enrollment into text refill reminders, all driven by e-support solutions. Quite different populations. And on the provider side, we all know providers have a very different workflows, office settings, familiarity with specialty products, communication preferences, and a number of other preferences. A small group practice that mostly refers out scripts to the specialty pharmacy is vastly different than a large medical practice or center having its own specialty pharmacy and patient advocate teams. Some offices are tech savvy and want to do everything themselves, and others will rely on that old favorite, the fax, and they will need billing and coding help in addition. That's all fine. Your service provider needs to be able to flex to do that though, and make the process as simple and as seamless and reliable as possible. These are just a few examples of the patient and provider perspectives that you must keep in mind when defining overlay services for your program. Consider which nuances you can bring into your program set of services, as well as how they drive value for the patient and the provider. Some of this can be achieved by people, some of this can be achieved by technology. All of these things need to be measured though. Kevin, why don't you talk about technology in this area?
It's very important that when you look to invest in technology solutions, that you're not only consolidating process, but you're educating why they should use them and what the value of the services are going to be. So when you look at some of the components of the program that Jan highlighted, we used a very strong focus on enrollment activities and reimbursement support. And those are very important. But you also want to focus on some of those add-on features. If you're going to invest in nursing services and travel programs and copay and patient assistance components, we got to think about those two terms I started with. Consolidating process. You don't want to duplicate efforts of either your patient or provider because they can become very frustrated in how they leverage and access your programs. The programs designs that we're used to in the market, you have to enter the same information on duplicative forms multiple times. Why am I providing my NPI number to you again? Haven't I already provided this information to you historically? Those aren't the types of conversations that you want to have with your patients and providers. If they enroll into your programs, you want to streamline that process and educate them on if they're going to have to and what's going to come out on the other side. If they have a copay program that then they'll have a $20 copay after they enroll, you want to set that up front so that they're not surprised that they went through an entire process and still have a $20 copay. It's very important to set up those expectations. If there is a travel program that requires a receipt component that they'll need to log back in and upload the receipt and get reimbursed on the back end of service execution, that's something that as they enroll or opt into your programs that you want to set that expectation. You also don't want them to start with an electronic solution and then have to mail things in or call things in. If they can start a service online, you want them to be able to track it, maintain it, and keep up with the program and what's happening through the same method that they initiated. The most frustrating thing that I've seen on the market is to say I did all my enrollments online, but then I still got inundated with calls. That's why provider portal adoption can be very challenging in our industry. Anything that you want to start electronic, you want to be able to maintain in the electronic communication flow. And traditionally, that's been for provider-facing assets. You want that to be for your patients too. If they enroll and provide their electronic enrollment online, you want to be able to set expectations that they're approved and what that means. So it's more than just a 800 number at the end of providing an electronic signature, but will they be getting calls? If they're getting calls, can they opt out of those calls? Can they themselves say my preferred method of communication is text or email so that those triggers are set up online and not after they receive a call after they start electronically? If they logged into your portal online, it's probably because they didn't want to take the time to call and they're already very technology focused individuals. So you want to maintain those communications and work with partners that have done that before. In segment one, we talked a lot about ways to initiate those services, maintain those services, and evolve throughout your brand lifecycle. So it's important to introduce those to both your patients and providers at the right time. So if they kick off and they receive their first ever injection training through your nurse program through an online solution, you don't want that to change over time because they've established what they feel is their best practice of interacting with your team. It's the same thing with copay or patient assistance or that travel component that we talked about. That's becoming more and more relevant when you think of things like cell therapies and gene therapies, where we're seeing transitions to what is allowed to support patients. You want a technology organization that can evolve. So as you implement those, you maintain a level of confidence in the services that you support. Those are all things that you want to consider when you're investing in these technology solutions. Jan, was there anything else that you wanted to consider when talking about service design?
A couple of things to be also considering, because as you sit there in the audience, you may have already said to yourself, wow, I've already heard this stuff. What I really want to know is, how do you deliver this? As you consider which partner is the best for your program, look for experience, because there are providers out there who have developed these offerings before. Make sure that there's a history and understanding and documentation of that history to show you. You should not be having a conversation where your partner is asking you, where do you think this will work? Or do you think this will or won't play out here? You want a partner who has experience and can show you models and features that worked in the past or similar products. You want them to educate you, to consult with you. The same can be said for providers. There's a lot of vendors that offer online enrollment pieces and some EPA components, but you also need to allow your providers to drive some of those services. Let's take nursing components, for example. You can actually allow providers to trigger communications and secure messages to get patients onto those programs in case patients don't know where to find those service enrollments on your brand page. The office can trigger the communication right after the patient's appointment so that it's top of mind and can be taken care of as the patient leaves the office. Speaking of speedy transactions, Kevin, why don't you elaborate on how to track turnaround times and using those measurements to support program performance?
A key piece of technology is obviously saying what efficiencies. When you don't want to just have a blanket statement that this is going to make things faster and this is going to make things easier, and then deliver the exact same turnaround times if they had sent things through on paper. So those are things that you're going to want to track, measure, and provide transparency to the people interacting with your office. It's very important to get those communications, not just in QBRs, not just on dashboards that are online, but the people that are interacting with your office. It's key to measure each interaction, each service design, and how that impacts your patients getting on therapy. We're going to spend time in segment 3 talking more about that. But it's key for you to consider that as you're implementing these programs, that you're measuring each step, whether it's a reimbursement component, a free goods component, or an interaction where you're providing those transportation services. If you're going to schedule a nurse to go out and they're going to leverage your program, does that add time? And that might not necessarily be a bad thing, but it's important that you have that level of transparency, not only to design and select your services, but measure them in every component and based on how it's initiated. The key is to be able to measure them and communicate them maybe to your patients, but definitely to your providers. Your providers are confident enough to step away from their fax machine and drive an online tool to access your services through technology. You want to be able to manage your expectation. And when I say manage their expectation, it's not the person in the marketing department, but the person that's in their office, and say, if you leverage our online solution, we can have a nurse in their home within, on average, X amount of time. If they leverage transportation, that the patient or the doctor can coordinate their specialty pharmacy shipment to align when the patient will be in, leveraging that transportation services. So a lot of times when we say this may take an extra 2 days, but a patient needs that transportation to get access to your product in the first place. So to be able to measure it and provide that level of insight to your providers on why they should leverage your technology isn't necessarily to only get things faster, but also manage their and their patients' expectations, which is key. Moving on, I know, Jan, you may have some questions from our audience.
Yeah, some of the things I want to talk about for just a moment is the integration that you see online for EPA solutions, real-time copay enrollment and real-time PAP enrollment are really great for improving patient and provider experience and streamlining the process. And those e-support services should be integrated in the back end of your patient support CRM. But to that very point, is your patient solution provider your hub? Is it still bogged down in a manual administrative work mode? Are they able to integrate into these solutions? Or are you missing out on a major opportunity to improve your patient support efficiency? It's kind of like buying this beautiful brand new car, but then the individual driving it is not going to be available to drive or legal to drive for another 2.5 years. So these are things where you need to weigh out where is the efficiency and where are you gaining? And then where are going to be the barriers? Data intake specialists enter the same information that can be captured online. The faxes that are scanned and entered into your system is the same information that could be captured online. So when you think about your program design, remember that technology can enable you to reduce touch points for patients and providers through self-service, while also reducing touch points on the back end of your program services. For example, if your provider can type in 5 pieces of information online that pulls up the appropriate prior auth form, why can't your patient support provider enjoy the same functionality before they ever consider just picking up the phone and calling the insurance company and sitting for 45 minutes to an hour at different times of the year on that phone? The same can be said for the back-end copay and PAP features as well. When a data entry person intakes a case or the fax is scanned into the system, that data entry person should know that the PA process, what it will be, what it will contain, and the patient will be approved for copay if they applied for copay, and if the patient will be approved for PAP if they applied for PAP. This can likely be done before the agent ever calls an insurance company. And we all know your patient support teams love waiting on hold with those health plans. So Kevin, maybe you can weigh in here and give your thoughts on how a provider can deliver the support services, a patient solutions provider.
All right, so we've covered a lot in our first 2 segments of this webinar on both technology and patient solutions and considering what types of services your brand needs depending on where it is in its life cycle. So how do you know which service provider can deliver the level of support that your brand needs? As Jen referenced earlier, it's important that they have a resume on both the patient service solutions as well as the technology. So they should be able to show you examples of the type of patient engagement services that we've discussed, whether it's nursing components, copay and patient assistance components, travel, or reimbursement. If they've only delivered reimbursement services or can only show you examples of that, do you know that they have an out-of-the-box solution for transportation services? If you're going into the cell and gene therapy, do they have experience with those unique needs for those types of products? Jan talked about the difference between buy and bill and pharmacy benefit services. Well, maybe it's a disease state that isn't used to buy and bill. Do they have examples of where they've had to educate offices on new practices or how they partner with field reimbursement, whether it's through data, but through other unique interactions that helps your teams be successful? It's very important to consider not only their patient services resume, but if you think the long-term strategy for your brand does have a linkage between technology and patient services, are they a patient services team that's trying to catch up with where the industry is technology-wise? Or do they have out-of-the-box technology solutions that they have proven track records that shows that they have success in those areas? It's very important that when you're measuring a service provider, that it's not their first time in the disease state, also not the first time building these types of technology solutions. So when it comes to patient engagement, I talked about the importance on the last slide in the last component of our webinar of providing something that's both consolidated and educates them and keeps them leveraging that technology, but it has to be something with a proven track record. I think it's very important to measure that when selecting a vendor. Jan, do you think there's anything else they should consider when selecting the vendor to move forward with their patient service solution?
Yes, some of the things that I think you need to think about when considering a service provider, because it is very serious. You're embedding a lot of dollars and time of your brand with this service provider, is to understand, do they really fit your culture? And what I mean by that is when you ask a question, is there a canned answer that's coming back, or are they relating it to something that you've just said, referencing it back, and really understanding what your thought process is, where you're headed with this? Maybe because as a manufacturer you really haven't articulated that, then one of the things that I would suggest is that you ask them to provide understanding and feedback as to what they think you should be putting into play. What are the services and why do they suggest that it's a certain set of services, and at what point are they suggesting that you trigger those? And does that seem reasonable? Is there good clarity and understanding around those specific responses that they're providing you? Doesn't mean that you have to agree with what they're saying, but do you see logic to what they're representing, or do you think it's just a table in the back of their head that has dollar signs on it as they begin to walk through services with you.
I couldn't agree more with Jan on the importance of the culture and transparency. I think it's important to partner with a service provider that's going to provide transparency, even when it comes to bad news, and partners closely with you on the solutions. I think transparency throughout service design, throughout service execution, and if the train gets off the tracks, being able to partner closely with you to get it back on the tracks and help you manage internal expectations. It is key to be both aligned culture-wise and transparency. That wraps up our segment on aligning technology and talent-enabled services as part of our second webinar. We'll be moving on to webinar 3 next, implementing service designs based on brand needs. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to talking to you next time.